Hello everyone, my name is Alex and you're listening to the Staggered Stance podcast where I give my staggered stance on anything and everything stand-up paddleboarding as well as personal and lifestyle. I've been starting to do this thing on the podcast where I go 1 week talking about paddleboarding specifically and then another week where I talk about something personal, something that I'm interested in, and somehow, one way or another, tie it to stand-up paddleboarding. I do think that while paddleboarding is the main topic of this podcast, I also want to kind of branch into other things because I do have so many more interests additional to stand-up paddleboarding. So allowing myself to branch out and not feel stuck with one topic is definitely really good for me, and I'm able to experiment more and try new things with the podcast. Today I wanted to have a conversation about identity. Now, when it comes to topics like these, it is very common for the people that you are hearing it from to have one specific opinion, or just it's very common in media in general for people to express their opinion, their bias. And when it comes to things like these specifically, I always have one or two sources that are completely different to each other. I have specifically podcasts that when it comes to a topic, I have one podcast that talks about that topic through one lens and then another podcast that talks about the topic through another lens. So either way, I am always getting kind of like almost the full picture or at least two opposing opinions or belief systems through that topic so that I can kind of understand everything and I can come to a personal decision myself and not rely on any specific person's opinion or belief set towards that topic. And so with this podcast, well, there's definitely going to be a lot of episodes where I talk about my opinion, my biases, because again, this is my podcast and I'm not going to bash people that only have one opinion in their podcast. The whole point is for when people to watch their podcast or to listen to their podcast to hear their opinion. I'm not bashing people about it, but when it comes to this conversation, I am very open about the different possibilities, especially because I find myself in the middle ground. I'm a very neutral person when it comes to this topic, so I'm not going to share only one side of the conversation. So when you're listening to this, I'm going to be showing one side of the conversation, the other side of the conversation. I'm going to be showing the two extremes, and I want you to come to a decision yourself. Whether it be one extreme, whether it be the other extreme, or finding a healthy middle ground where you identify with both sides. And that's really where I find myself in this conversation. I definitely find myself in the middle ground. There's things that I identify with one side of the conversation and also identify with on the other side of the conversation. So when you listen to this episode, I definitely want you to pick and choose what you want to believe in and what you want to decide as what you want to take with once you're done with this episode. And I also encourage you to reflect on what I'm hearing and maybe even come up with different opinions or views of this topic that I didn't even mention that you feel like you identify with more. Because this topic in general is not set in stone. It is forever changing in a societal level and a personal level for every single person. There is not one person who has the exact same identity as another. So let's get into the conversation. You can tell that I am very interested in this topic because on top of the fact that just in general it's really interesting, it's also very fresh in my mind because I have been struggling with my identity in the past few months, in the past year even, or if you could say even since I moved to Mexico, because I'll talk about that later. But whether I'm Mexican, American, it definitely affects my perspective on my identity. But anyways, I'll go into my personal examples later through this conversation. Let's first talk about pro-identity, being okay with identity, being okay with identifying yourself with certain things. The word identity itself is defined as the set of qualities, beliefs, personality traits, appearance, and or expressions that characterize a person or a group. These are specific traits that you attach to yourself, and these traits are a very big determinant of how you go through life, and they are what separate you from any other person in the world. It creates this sense of uniqueness towards you, and you can find great pride with what you identify as or what your identity gears towards. Identity also gives you immense direction and motivation. It drives you to action, and it determines whether or not you will maintain this action. I forgot to mention this, but I will also be grabbing quotes and topics of conversation through 3 different sources. I have one source that tackles one extreme, another source that tackles another extreme, and then a source that kind of is in the middle, kind of talks about both extremes. So the source that talks about the extreme when it comes to like pro-identity, I'm using the article from Very Well Mind, written by Sanjay Gupta. Hope I said that right. And it is titled Why Identity Matters and How It Shapes Us. And I did grab a lot of topics and points from that article that I did use at the beginning of this podcast episode. But when it comes to quotes specifically, I am going to be grabbing from Atomic Habits by James Clear. Atomic Habits is more of a neutral, in my opinion. It talks about the good and the bad, so I'll be using it for both sides. And then for the other extreme, I will be using The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson. So to continue with the conversation, where do we leave off? It allows you to understand your goals and values. There's a quote from the book Atomic Habits that says, the more pride you have in a particular aspect of your identity, the more motivated you'll be to maintain the habits associated with it. So that just kind of shows how identity is directly correlated to your motivation and your incentive to do good in things that you identify yourself with. And that could really be anything. That could be having good skin. That could be your sport. That could be your academic achievements. It can literally be anything. There is a direct correlation to your identity and your drive and motivation to achieve things that align with it. Identity also allows you to easily make decisions. When we associate ourselves with a certain thing, we are more likely to make a decision that aligns with our identity. It is uncommon that you will find yourself making a decision that doesn't align with what you believe in. You prioritize certain things, and with that, you continue to put this view of yourself into the world and are consistently reassuring yourself of that alignment that you have. I have another quote from the book Atomic Habits that kind of aligns with what I just said. It says, quote, your behaviors are usually a reflection of your identity. What you do is an indication of the type of person you believe that you are, either consciously or non-consciously. Research has shown that once a person believes in a particular aspect of their identity, they are more likely to act in alignment with that belief. So if you identify as a non-drinker, you are very much less likely to go out and party and get drunk. If you identify as a good student, you are much less likely to leave assignments to the last minute. That doesn't mean that this doesn't happen. This doesn't mean that these don't happen. That you're just more likely to align yourself majority of the time to what you've set as what you are, what you identify as. Do a push-up every time I say identity or identify. So let me get into a little few personal examples when it comes to this topic. I myself identify as a very studious, good grades, motivated, perfectionist type of person. Everything that I do, I have to reach a certain level of understanding or professionalism, if that makes sense. Just a certain level of advancement. I have to be good at what I do in order to feel okay with me doing it. Kind of to the point where someone would go, okay, she knows what she's doing. She knows her stuff. I also identify as a paddler, as a stand-up paddleboarder, and I also identify as a Mexican more than an American, just because of my upbringing. And because of me identify more as a Mexican, I also identify myself as a more open-minded, multicultural individual. And if we're going down the list, I also identify as a very anti-consumerist individual, and just all in all being very aware of my environmental footprint and talking about being aware of our environmental footprint. I do think that is a really big part of my identity, and all these things influence me on my day-to-day life. When it comes to making the podcast, I'm a very perfectionist person. As you can see, since the beginning, I've had a microphone, I've had a good camera. I try my best to be very well spoken. I want the podcast episodes and themes to be educational, important, relevant to the topic of conversation and just in general of what I'm going through. When it comes to paddling, I am going to competitions. I'm trying my best during trainings. I hope to someday go to the World Championships. When it comes to being a Mexican, I am currently in the process of becoming a Mexican citizen. And when it comes to anti-consumerism, I am always being very aware of what I am purchasing and am actively thinking on a day-to-day basis on how I can minimize my carbon footprint. And those are a few things of what I identify with and how it is actively a part of my life, in my day-to-day life. So that's a big part of why I am like pro identity, or at least some aspects of it, right? Because like I said, I'm in the middle ground. So with all that discussed, talked about, communicated, I want to now start talking about anti-identity. Now, I rarely ever see this talked about. It's always like, oh, you have to align yourself with what you identify with. Oh, it's identity is a very important part for a lot of people's lives, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be important. Like I said before, identity is so important to find your motivation, your drive, your desires. But depending on what you identify with, how you identify yourself, you may be indirectly sabotaging yourself by only allowing yourself to align with certain things. This could cause you to be closed off to certain beliefs, perspectives, points of views, or even lifestyles and ideologies. In general, depending on how you identify yourself, you can develop a very biased perspective of how the world works and how you flow through it. In a way, identity can be assuring and damaging at the same time. Now, I know I just talked about my personal examples, but I wanted to go back on it and kind of talk about my identity through this new perspective. So I identified myself as a very studious, good grades, motivated, perfectionist type person. A lot of these identifiers came from school, 17 years that I was in school, and I definitely based myself a lot off of my grades and how well I did academically. And so when I graduated, there was nothing to directly reflect or confirm my identity. All of a sudden, there was no need for me to get good grades because I wasn't in school. There was no determining factor of like, oh, you're doing good, like you're getting good grades, you're on a good path. That was what grades were for me. And so when I no longer had that, I lost a huge sense of identity, and I couldn't confirm what I was feeling in any way because the thing that I normally confirmed that with was no longer in my life. On top of the fact that my motivation, my internal motivation, really relied on the structure that my school gave me. Even though a lot of my motivation would be for paddling, for example, my paddling was influenced by my school one way or another because I had to go train and then I had to go to school. I had to go back to training and then I had to make sure I had all of my assignments done. There was a structure throughout my day because of school, and in that was my motivation. So when the structure of school was no longer a factor in my day, I found myself really struggling with my motivation. And also because I had no motivation, and I was also entering a new era of my life. I was looking for jobs. I was learning to be a functioning member of society that their entire life wasn't based on school. I also had new habits, just so many changes, and everything was new, so I wasn't good at everything. That part of me also being a perfectionist, I was no longer able to align with me being a perfectionist because I wasn't perfect with all these things because everything was so new. So within a few months of me graduating, and specifically at the beginning of this year, everything that I had identified myself as was no longer there. I really struggled to find out who I was and what I was doing these things for. There wasn't anything tying me down to a specific belief system or structure or action, and so I felt that I was really just floating. And that was also a really big topic of conversation that I had or talked about 2 weeks ago with the struggles of adulthood. What am I doing with my life? Also, another thing that is not really specific to now, but it is something that I've been struggling with for the past several years. When I was younger, I identified as a Mexican. Even though I was born in the United States, I do not find any relation or essentially any connection to the country or where I was from, besides the fact that I speak the most common language up there and I have grandparents up there. But as I got older and as I was traveling more to the country, to the United States, whether that be for competitions or seeing grandparents, I learned a lot more about the country. And so I started to feel more comfortable aligning myself with the country, with the United States, with their practices, because I was learning more about it. And then this also kind of put into perspective, am I feeling more identified or related to the country because I keep on visiting it? or because I was born there. And then also, like, if I were to go to another country constantly, like if I were to travel there, would I have the same relationship that I have with the United States as I would with this country? Or is this relation to this country more serious or like more kind of internal because I know that I was born there? Now, that is a very heavy topic, and that is something that I am dealing with and have been dealing with for a while. But to go back into what the main thing that I was talking about, I used to identify myself as a Mexican. But the more that I learned about the United States, I kind of shifted my perspective, like, oh, maybe I can identify a little bit more with the United States. So everything in general, everything about my life was just changing. And everything was surrounded by identity. And so the grand old question, if I never identified myself with these things, would I be having this much conflict? And the question in general, is identity actually important or relevant to a person? Is it actually productive? Is it actually good for you? Or does it just put you in a box? Now I want to get into a few quotes from the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. I'm not going to say the F word because this is a PG podcast. But I am going to bring up a few quotes of what is talked about in the book, because this book in general, it's a really, really good book. It is a book that has very opposing views of what we normally hear when it comes to these topics. And it really kind of puts into perspective a completely different, it puts the topic of discussion in a completely different perspective and really opens your mind to another way of seeing it. So the first quote that I'm going to bring up is, quote, "The more you try to be certain about something, the more certain and insecure you'll feel. But the more you embrace being uncertain and not knowing, the more uncomfortable you will feel in knowing what you don't know." Now, you can rewind that. You can rewind that so you can like listen to it again so it kind of like hits. And it is very like, it is difficult to understand, right? But the more you kind of think about it, the more it makes sense. And I'll be using an example of my life to kind of like explain the quote further. So the first part is, the more you try to be certain about something, the more certain and insecure you'll feel. So with me, that really hits when it comes to stand-up paddleboarding. I, for a while, have identified myself as a paddler. I'm a paddler through and through. Like, I identify myself as a paddler. So when I would struggle with motivation or when I didn't get the results that I wanted to get, I very much questioned my sense of identity in relation to stand-up paddleboarding. Like, oh, I'm not that good. Am I really a paddleboarder? So the more that I told myself that I was a paddler, anytime that my motivation or my drive would fluctuate, I'd question myself. Like, oh, are you really a paddleboarder if you don't feel motivated to get up in the morning, you know? So the next part of the quote is, "But the more you embrace being uncertain and not knowing, the more comfortable you will feel in knowing what you don't know." While I don't have like a direct kind of relation to this part of the quote, I do believe that kind of going through the motions and living in the moment and kind of going bit by bit is definitely a lot better than kind of creating a solid identity for yourself. It's so much more freeing and liberating to be able to make decisions in the moment instead of making decisions that align with a certain belief system. This is really big when I was in Europe, where I tried things that I thought that I never would, because also I was in a completely new environment. So all of these kind of like belief systems that I had at home, all of these kind of like stable parts of my life, they were no longer there. So it felt a lot easier to let go of them and try something new. And so once I came back, even though those solid parts of my life are now back in my life because I was back home, that urge to kind of just make decisions in the moment and live in the moment still pertained and are still there today. And now I'm very much like a lot more like open-minded person, even more than I was before. And being able to make decisions in the moment definitely helped me and has made me grow so much as a person since October of last year when I took my trip. Another quote from this book is, quote, "Uncertainty also relieves us of our judgment of ourselves." And I did mention this a lot prior. When I was certain, when I had a specific identity or belief of myself and I didn't reach those expectations that I had for myself, I then questioned my identity. I questioned whether or not I had the right, or why just in general I aligned myself with that identity. So here's the big thing. Not knowing who I am is in turn allowing myself to be more free. And it relieves the self-consciousness and the self-judgment that I carry towards myself. If I identify myself as a person who goes and trains 4 times a week, but I miss one of those days, I'm going to question myself. But if I'm the type of person that's like, you know what, I'm going to try my best, I'm going to get out there as much as I can when I feel like it, I am not tying myself down to a specific identity or a specific belief. I'm allowing myself to have an open perspective of the action that I'm trying to do. And then another quote is, the more times we admit we do not know, the more opportunities we gain to learn. And this was a really big thing that I learned in the past several years. That's like, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be a perfectionist with all these topics. You don't have to you also don't have to share your opinion on every single thing. And you should be open to hearing about different opinions, different belief systems, different points of views, even if they don't align with your identity. So then there's also if you don't have an identity, you are more open to these topics of conversation. You don't have an internal bias when you hear these different points of views. And then another quote, the more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. And then that is exactly what I've been talking about. If you find a point of view that doesn't necessarily align with what you believe, you will immediately or unintentionally just kind of push it off to the side and not really pay much attention to it. But when you allow yourself, when you open yourself up to everything pretty much, to all these points of views, when you don't tie yourself down to a specific belief system or a specific identity, you are then opening yourself to a world of different ideologies and beliefs. And you won't feel the need to hide from things that don't align with your perspective. So while identity is very, very important for your drives, your desire, your motivation, it can also hinder you in a lot of ways. And so when it comes to me, I definitely believe that I am in the middle ground. There are some things that I am open to identifying with and help me go through life, go through the motions, but there's also a lot of things that allowing myself to not identify with a specific thing, it is opening my mind and my knowledge to different perspectives and different points of views that I otherwise would have never paid attention to had I been stuck on a certain belief system tied to a specific identity. So to wrap all of this up, the last quote that I'll be talking about is from The Subtle Art of Not Giving Enough by Mark Manson, and that is, I say don't find yourself. Never know who you are. And that is where I'm going to end this podcast episode. Thank you so much for listening. I think this is going to be one of my most favorite episodes I've ever posted, really. I really hope that you took on a new perspective, maybe confirmed with you things that you had thought about, maybe learned something new. Make sure to rate the podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, it's on Amazon Music, it's also on YouTube. So make sure to give it a little bit of love wherever you are listening or watching from. I post every week, and next week it is going to be paddle themed. So I will catch you then. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll catch you guys next week. Bye-bye.